The gate was iron, black with rust along the lower hinges, and it stood about 8 feet tall with a crossbar at the top that read, Silver Ridge, in letters that had once been painted gold. Most of the gold was gone now. What remained was a faint yellow outline, like a memory of something that used to matter. Clara Hartwell stood in front of it and did not move for almost a full minute. She was 31 years old and looked older. 3 weeks of walking the Wyoming frontier in October had done that to her, stripped the softness from her face, cracked her lips, turned her hands into something she barely recognized when she held them up in the morning light. The dress she wore had been gray once, a practical traveling gray, but it had since graduated to the color of road dust and dried mud, and the hem was stiff at the bottom from where she'd walked through a creek crossing outside Dalton and hadn't had the time or the warmth to properly dry it out. She had a bag. It was a worn leather satchel, the strap repaired twice with strips of rawhide, and it held 3 things: a change of underclothing, a small knife her husband Thomas had given her on their wedding day, and a folded letter that she could no longer bring herself to read, but couldn't bring herself to throw away either. 17 doors. That was the count. 17 households between here and the burned-out shell of the Hartwell homestead outside Castor's Creek, where she'd buried Thomas in July and Lily in August, 7 weeks apart, and then stood in the ruins of her own life and tried to figure out what came next. She'd gone north first, then east, then circled back west when east turned out to be nothing but closed faces and half-spoken suggestions that maybe she ought to try the county refuge in Laramie. She was not going to the county refuge in Laramie. She reached out and pushed the gate. It wasn't locked. It swung inward with a groan that sounded like something in pain, and she stepped through onto the gravel drive that curved up toward the main house of Silver Ridge Ranch. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected. She'd heard about it in Millhaven, the last town she'd passed through, from a woman at the dry goods counter who'd said, "Silver Ridge? That's Nathan Cross's place. Big spread. He's not a friendly man, but he's a fair one, mostly." The woman had paused to wrap a parcel of salt pork. "Lost his wife 2 years back. Got 2 little girls he can't manage on his own. You might try there if you're looking for work." Clara had not told the woman she'd tried 6 other households that week. The main house was 2 stories, built from timber and riverstone, with a covered porch running the full width of the front. There were outbuildings scattered around the grounds, a large barn, 2 smaller sheds, a smokehouse, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and the whole property had the look of something that had been well tended once and was now just getting by. A fence post near the barn needed replacing. One of the porch boards had warped and lifted at one corner. There were weeds coming up along the base of the water trough. Not neglect, exactly. Just the slow slide of things when there aren't enough hands. She was 30 yards from the porch when the front door opened and a man came out. He was tall, taller than Thomas had been, with dark hair that needed cutting and 3 days of beard going gray at the jaw. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, despite the cold, and he stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something and was already calculating how long this would take. "Gate was open," Clara said, because he was looking at the drive like he expected an explanation for how she'd gotten up it. "I know it was." He crossed his arms. "What do you want?" "Not can I help you. Not good afternoon. What do you want?" She appreciated it, actually. She was tired of the ones who smiled first and said no later. It was cleaner this way. "Work," she said. "I've heard you've had trouble keeping help with your daughters. I'm looking for a position. Housekeeping, cooking, looking after the children. I'll take room and board and whatever wage you think is fair for 30 days, and at the end of 30 days you can decide if you want to keep me on or not." He stared at her for a moment. "You come from town?" "Millhaven. Before that, Dalton. Before that, I've been a few places." "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. A woman at the dry goods told me you might have a need, that's all." He looked at her the way people look at things they haven't decided how to feel about yet. She stood still under the examination. She was used to it by now. The looking, the measuring, the quiet calculations. What she was not used to was what he said next. "You eaten today?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth and closed it again. It was such a specific, practical question, and she had not been asked it in a long time. "Not since yesterday morning," she said, because she had decided some weeks ago that lying about her circumstances only prolonged things. He uncrossed his arms. "Come up on the porch." His name was Nathan Cross, and he did not offer her coffee or sit down with her or make any pretense of hospitality. What he did was go inside and come back with a plate of cornbread and a heel of cured ham and a jar of water, which he set on the porch rail and then stepped back and leaned against the post while she ate. She ate carefully. She had learned to do that, to pace herself, to not tear into food the way her body wanted to, because eating too fast after too long made a person sick, and she could not afford to be sick on somebody's porch. He watched her but didn't make her feel watched, if that made sense. He looked out at the yard mostly, and she ate. And when she was halfway through the cornbread, he spoke. "I've had 4 women through here in 2 years," he said. 2 of them quit inside of a week. 1 lasted 3 weeks and left in the middle of the night. The 4th one I had to let go because she was giving Rose laudanum to keep her quiet. He said it flatly, without visible emotion, the way a person reports a weather pattern. "My daughters are not easy." "I didn't think they would be," Clara said. "Abigail is 12. She's got a sharp tongue and she'll use it on you. Rose is 8. She doesn't talk much anymore. Hasn't since—" He stopped. "Since last year. She'll follow you around and stare at you, and it unnerves most people." "I've been unnerved by worse." He glanced at her then. "You got family?" "No." "Husband." "He passed in July." "Children?" She took a breath and took a bite of cornbread. "A daughter. She passed in August." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. He didn't say he was sorry. She was grateful for that too. "I'm sorry" was the thing people said when they didn't know what else to say, and it sat like a stone in every conversation she'd had since Lily died. 30 days, he said finally. "Room in the house, board, $4 at the end of it if I think you've earned it. I won't pay you for the 30 days if you quit before they're up. That's not negotiable." "That's fair. I eat at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. The girls eat the same. I don't require elaborate cooking. I require it on time and that there's enough of it." "Understood. You'll share the upstairs with the girls. There's a room at the end of the hall that's been empty." He paused. "I'll ask you not to go into the room across from it. That one's closed." His wife's room, she figured. She didn't ask. "One more thing," he said. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd started eating. His eyes were dark brown, and they had the quality of eyes that had seen more than they wanted to and were still deciding what to do with it. "Don't make my daughters promises. Don't tell them you're going to stay. Don't tell them things are going to be fine. Don't tell them anything you're not certain is true. They've had enough of that." Clara set the empty plate back on the rail and stood up straight. "I won't," she said. "I never make promises I can't keep." He looked at her for another moment, then nodded once, the same way you'd sign a document. "There's a room upstairs," he said. "Second door on the left. Your things can go in there." He picked up the plate and went inside, and she stood on the porch for a moment in the cold October air, looking out at the yard of Silver Ridge Ranch, and thought, 18 was different to Transum. The room was small and cold and smelled of cedar and disuse. There was a narrow bed against one wall with a quilt folded at the foot of it, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a window that looked out over the back of the property toward a line of cottonwood trees along what she guessed was a creek. The ceiling sloped down on one side where the roof followed the angle of the porch below. She set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "Don't cry," she told herself. "Not now. Not yet." She had a complicated relationship with crying. It wasn't that she was too proud for it. She'd done plenty of it, in the dark, in the brush, along the road when she was alone, and there was no risk of anyone seeing her lose her footing. But there was a timing to it. You cried after you were safe. You cried after you had a door that locked and a floor that was yours for the night, and enough food in your stomach that you weren't lightheaded. You didn't cry on the way in. You cried when you'd made it, just far enough. She pressed her hands against her eyes and breathed. Thomas, she thought, not calling to him, not in the way people talked to the dead like they were still listening from somewhere, just thinking his name, remembering his voice, remembering the specific sound of Lily laughing, which had been a bright, piercing thing, like a bell struck clean. "I'm somewhere," she told them. "I've got a room. I'm going to be all right." She sat there for a little while, and then she got up and washed her face in the basin with the cold water from the pitcher and changed her collar and her cuffs. The dress itself was unwearable in its current state and would need washing badly, and went downstairs to find the kitchen and figure out what she was working with. The kitchen was at the back of the house, large and well equipped by frontier standards. There was an iron range that had been banked low, a good-sized table with 6 chairs, a dry sink, and a pantry room off to the right with shelves that were reasonably well stocked. Someone had been cooking, badly. There were crusted pans soaking in a bucket and a pot on the back of the range with something in it that she decided not to investigate too closely. She was checking the flour bin when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She turned. Standing in the kitchen doorway was a girl, 12 or close to it. She had the uneven quality of a child who'd started stretching toward something and wasn't sure yet what it was going to be. Dark hair pulled back in a braid that was half undone, a dress that was clean but had been let out at the hem recently and unevenly. She was thin in a way that suggested she ate when she remembered to and forgot more than she should. Her face was her father's face, the same strong jaw, the same eyes that said, "I'm watching you and I haven't decided yet." "You're the new one," the girl said. "I am," Clara said. "Clara Hartwell. You must be Abigail." "Who told you my name?" "Your father." Abigail leaned against the door frame with the studied carelessness of someone who wanted to appear unbothered and wasn't quite managing it. "He hired you then?" "He did. 30-day trial. That's what he said about the last 3. She paused. "Mrs. Fowler lasted 22 days. Before her, Miss Dean lasted 9. Before her, Mrs. Hooper lasted 4. What happened to them?" Abigail lifted one shoulder in a shrug that was trying to be casual and landing somewhere closer to defensive. "They left." "Why?" The girl's eyes narrowed slightly, like she'd expected deflection and gotten something else. "Because we weren't what they wanted." "What did they want?" "Easy." Abigail said the word flatly. "They wanted it to be easy. Rose cries at night sometimes, and she won't say why, and She stopped, recalibrated. "I'm not always easy to get along with." "I didn't come here because I thought it would be easy," Clara said. She turned back to the flour bin. "Do you know where the baking powder is kept? I'd like to make biscuits for supper." There was a pause. "Second shelf in the pantry," Abigail said, "behind the cornmeal." "Thank you." She heard the girl's footsteps move into the kitchen and stop near the table, not leaving, not sitting down either, just staying. Rose appeared at supper. She came in from outside, where she'd apparently been the whole afternoon, somewhere on the property. Nobody seemed alarmed by this, so Clara took her cue from that. And she was smaller than Clara had pictured from Nathan's description. 8 years old and built slight, with a round face and hair the color of creek water in autumn, a reddish brown that caught the lamplight. She was wearing a coat 2 sizes too big and carrying something in her right hand, a flat gray stone, smooth and oval. She stopped when she saw Clara setting plates on the table. Clara looked at her and said, "Hello, Rose," and then looked back at the plates and kept setting them. She heard Rose cross the kitchen floor and pull out the chair at the far end. Not the closest one, not the farthest, the one with the best sight line to the whole room, and sit down. Abigail came in from the hallway. Nathan came in from outside, boots on the rug, hands washed at the pump. They sat down. Clara brought the biscuits and the leftover ham she'd found and sliced, and a pot of beans she'd had time to season properly, and she sat down last at the remaining chair. Nathan said nothing by way of grace. That suited her fine. For the first several minutes, nobody spoke. Rose turned the stone over in her palm under the table. Clara could hear the faint sound of it. Abigail ate with her eyes on her plate. Nathan ate steadily and without comment, and twice refilled his coffee from the pot she'd left on the table. Then Rose looked up. She looked directly at Clara. Not shy, not combative, just looking with a kind of focused attention that Clara had seen before in children who had learned that watching was safer than asking. "I like biscuits," Rose said. Her voice was soft, a little unused sounding, like a door on hinges that hadn't been opened in a while. "Good," Clara said. "I'll make them again." Rose looked back down at her plate. Abigail glanced between them with an expression Clara couldn't fully read. Guarded, watchful, something complicated. Nathan said nothing. After supper, when the girls had gone upstairs and Clara was washing up, she heard Nathan come back into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Rose hasn't said that much at supper in 6 months," he said. Clara kept washing. "She just wanted biscuits." Maybe. She could hear in his voice that he wasn't sure if he was relieved or alarmed. "Good night, Mrs. Hartwell." "Good night, Mr. Cross." His footsteps went back down the hall, and she stood at the dry sink with the cold water running over her hands and the lamplight throwing a long shadow across the kitchen floor, and something that had been clenched in her chest for months loosened just slightly. She didn't call it hope. It was too early for hope, but it was something. The first week was hard in the ordinary ways. The range ran hot on the left side and you had to account for it or everything burned. The water pump froze in the mornings until the sun got up, which meant filling the reservoir the night before or hauling from the creek, which was a quarter-mile east. The supply of firewood for the house was adequate but needed splitting, and none of the ranch hands considered that their responsibility, which meant Clara split it herself after the second morning when she couldn't get the kitchen warm. Abigail watched her do it from the porch. "You've done that before," the girl said. "Many times." Clara set another log on the block. "You want to try? No? All right." She split the log. "The offer stands." The braid situation bothered her, the practical side of her at least. Abigail's hair was thick and long, and the braid she did herself every morning was the kind that started unraveling by noon. On the fourth morning, Clara came into the kitchen early and found Abigail already there, struggling with it in front of the small mirror propped on the windowsill. "Want help?" Clara asked. "No," Abigail said. Then, "I can't get the back." Clara crossed the kitchen and stood behind her and took the braid apart and started over. She didn't make conversation about it. She just braided, her fingers working steadily from the crown down, the way her mother had done for her when she was small. Abigail stood very still, like she was trying to be somewhere else while it was happening and not quite succeeding. "There," Clara said, and secured the end with the piece of ribbon Abigail had been using. "That'll hold." Abigail looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't say thank you. She turned away from the mirror and picked up her cup. "The eggs need collecting," she said. "Rose won't go because there's a rooster that chases her." "I'll get the eggs," Clara said. "You could come and run interference with the rooster if you want." Abigail looked at her over the rim of her cup. "What does that mean?" "Keep him busy on one side while I get the eggs on the other." A pause, a very guarded, very reluctant something that was the preliminary sketch of a smile. "He's mean," Abigail said. "So am I when I need to be," Clara said. They got the eggs without incident, mostly because Abigail turned out to have a talent for distracting the rooster that she claimed was from practice. Clara collected 11 eggs and didn't comment on the fact that Abigail had started talking again. About the rooster, about the hens, about a hawk that had gotten one of them in September. The whole way back to the kitchen. She filed it away. Small thing, but real. Nathan Cross was, as advertised, not a friendly man. He was not unfriendly either, exactly. He was removed. He ate at the table with his daughters every day and answered their questions and occasionally asked them questions about what they'd been doing. And it was not cold. It was not indifferent. But there was a layer of glass somewhere between him and everything around him, and Clara could see it, the way you see ice on a window. Barely, but it's there. And the world beyond it looks a little off, a little different from how it actually is. She learned his patterns. He was up before dawn, out with the hands. He came in at noon for exactly 30 minutes. He did the books in the evening in the small room off the main hall that served as an office, and the door was usually closed. If there was a problem with the house, a shutter latch that was sticking, a floorboard that had come up, he fixed it himself efficiently, without discussion, and she often came downstairs in the morning to find that something she'd noticed the day before had been quietly taken care of. She could work with that. She understood a person who communicated through action. On the 8th day, she found the problem. She'd been reorganizing the pantry, a task the pantry badly needed, and she'd pulled a crate away from the back wall to check what was behind it and found a collection of papers stacked and wrapped in oilcloth. Not hidden, exactly, just set aside. She wouldn't have thought anything of it except that the top paper, where the oilcloth had slipped, had a partial letterhead visible, the name of a law office in Cheyenne, and below it, 3 words that she read before she thought to look away. Petition for guardianship. She pushed the oilcloth back into place and moved the crate back and finished reorganizing the pantry and said nothing. But that night at supper, when Nathan asked her, in the routine way he asked every evening, if there was anything needed for the house, she looked at him across the table and she thought about the words on that paper, and she thought about Abigail's careful watchfulness and Rose's silence and the closed room upstairs, and she said, I think we're all right for now. Which was the honest answer, because she thought she was beginning to understand something about Silver Ridge, and what she understood was this. The danger here was not what she'd expected when she came through the gate. It wasn't poverty, it wasn't isolation, it wasn't the ordinary hard conditions of frontier living. The danger was quieter than that. It lived in a law office in Cheyenne, and it had a name she hadn't read yet, and it was coming. Be it. On the 14th day, Rose knocked on her door. It was late, past 9, full dark outside. And Clara had been awake reading by lamplight, the only luxury she'd given herself since arriving. She opened the door, and Rose was standing in the hallway in her nightgown, holding the gray stone in both hands, her feet bare on the cold floor. I had a bad dream, Rose said. Clara stepped back from the door. Come in. Rose came in and looked around the room in the particular way she had of looking at things. Thorough, quiet, absorbing. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the book. She looked at the view out the dark window. You can sit on the bed, Clara said. I'll move the lamp closer. Rose sat on the edge of the bed, cross-legged, and turned the stone over in her hands. Clara settled back against the headboard with her book, and they sat like that, not talking, not needing to, for a little while. Then Rose said, without looking up from the stone, Did you lose somebody? Clara was quiet for a moment. Yes. Who? My husband and my daughter. Rose looked up then. Her eyes were very serious. What was your daughter's name? Lily. How old was she? 4. Rose looked back down at the stone. She rubbed her thumb across the smooth surface. My mama went away, she said. Papa says she left. Abigail says she's not coming back. She paused. I don't know which one is right. Clara didn't say anything right away. She thought about what Nathan had told her. Don't make promises. Don't say things are going to be fine. She thought about what she actually knew, which was not much, and what she suspected, which was more. I think both things can be true at the same time, she said finally. She went away, and she's probably not coming back. That's a hard thing to carry. Rose considered this. Do you still carry it? About Lily? Every day, Clara said. Rose nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already believed. She unfolded from the bed and stood up, stone in hand. I'm going to go back to sleep, she said. All right. Leave the door open if you want. Rose walked to the door and then stopped. She turned around. I think Lily was lucky, she said, to have a mama who still carries it. Then she went back down the hall, her small feet quiet on the floorboards, and Clara sat in the lamplight with the book open in her lap and the cold air coming under the window, and thought about that sentence for a long time. She had been at Silver Ridge for 17 days when Nathan Cross found her standing at the paddock fence in the early evening, watching the horses. He came and stood beside her without announcing himself. They stood there for a while in the cooling air, the sun going down behind the mountains to the west and throwing the sky into a particular shade of dark orange that she had come to think of as a Wyoming color, something specific to this latitude, this land. Abigail told me about the rooster, he said. The rooster and I have reached an understanding. She said you split the firewood yourself. It needed doing. He was quiet for a moment. That wasn't part of what I asked you to do. I know. She watched a roan mare work the fence line, bored and restless. But it needed doing, so I did it. He turned and looked at her profile. She didn't turn to meet his gaze, but she was aware of it, the way you're aware of warmth from a window. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, why did you come to Wyoming? She considered the question. I was already here, she said. My husband and I homesteaded outside Castor's Creek. After he passed, it didn't seem worth going anywhere else in particular, so I just kept going, in no particular direction. And you ended up here. I ended up here. He looked back at the horses. "My daughters are different," he said, "since you came. It's only been 2 weeks. I know." He said it like that was the point, not the counter. "Rose talked at breakfast again this morning, about a bird she saw by the creek. She talked about it for 10 minutes, he paused. "She hasn't talked about birds since her mother left." Clara didn't say anything. "I don't know what you're doing," he said, "but whatever it is, don't stop." It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was something more careful than gratitude, something said by a man who had learned to be economical with the things that mattered. "I'm not doing anything in particular," Clara said. "I'm just here, every day. That's all." He didn't respond to that. But when he left a few minutes later, he said goodnight in a way that sounded different from the way he'd said it on the first night. And Clara turned it over in her mind for a while and couldn't quite explain the difference. Only that it sounded, for the first time, like he meant it. The 30-day trial passed without ceremony. There was no conversation about it, no formal acknowledgement on the morning of the 30th day. Nathan Cross came in for breakfast at 6 o'clock like he always did, sat down at the same chair, poured his coffee from the pot Clara had left on the table, and ate his eggs without comment. When he was done, he set $4 on the table beside his plate, not handed to her, just set there, and stood up. "If the arrangement suits you," he said, "you can stay on." "It suits me," Clara said. He nodded and went out, and that was the entirety of it. No handshake, no renegotiated terms, just the $4 and the implicit understanding that Silver Ridge was now, for however long it lasted, her place as much as anyone's. She pocketed the money and cleared the breakfast dishes. Abigail, who had been pretending to read at the other end of the table throughout this exchange, turned a page she definitely hadn't read. "He doesn't do speeches," she said, "in case you were expecting one." "I wasn't." "Good." She turned another unread page. "Mrs. Hooper cried when he let her go. He didn't know what to do with that." "I imagine not." "He doesn't know what to do with most things," Abigail said, with the particular candor of a 12-year-old who had been watching adults fail for long enough to have opinions about it. Then she seemed to catch herself and straightened up. "He's good with horses, though, and the books. He's very good with the books." "I believe it," Clara said, and meant it. She was learning Nathan Cross the way you learn a piece of land. Not all at once, but incrementally, one feature at a time, until you start to have a sense of the shape of the whole. He was meticulous where other men were careless. He paid his hands on time and in the amount promised, which she gathered from a conversation she wasn't supposed to overhear was not universal in the territory. He checked on the horses himself every evening, not delegating it, going out to the barn in whatever weather with a lantern and spending a quiet half hour in there that she thought probably had less to do with the horses' welfare and more to do with his own. He was also still the most thoroughly sealed-off person she had ever shared a house with. It wasn't coldness. She'd decided that early. Cold people had a quality of deliberate repulsion. They wanted distance, and they enforced it. Nathan wasn't repelling anything. He just had all the hatches battened down, every opening secured against the weather, and he'd been that way long enough that he'd probably stopped noticing the battening. She didn't try to open anything. It wasn't her place and it wasn't her business. She cooked, she cleaned, she looked after the girls, she split the firewood that kept not splitting itself, and she let Nathan Cross be whoever he needed to be inside his own locked rooms. What she could not control, and had not planned for, was the girls. Oh, Abigail was the harder one, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was the specific texture of Abigail's hardness. It wasn't meanness, not really, though it could look like meanness from the outside. It was armor. The girl had built herself a set of it over the last 2 years, piece by piece, fitted carefully to every vulnerable point, and she wore it so constantly that Clara suspected Abigail had started to forget it was armor and just thought it was herself. She tested Clara in the small ways first, answering questions with silence, disappearing when there were tasks to be done and reappearing the moment they were finished, saying things at the table with a precision designed to find the exact spot where a remark tipped from observation into provocation. Clara absorbed it. She did not take the bait, and she did not issue corrections, and she did not make the mistake of trying to pretend it wasn't happening. On a Thursday in late November, about 2 weeks into her second month, she was in the kitchen making soap, a long, unpleasant job involving lye and rendered fat and a great deal of careful attention, When Abigail came in from somewhere outside and stood in the middle of the kitchen and said, "You're not going to replace her," Clara kept stirring. The soap mixture had to be stirred constantly at this stage, or it seized. "I know that," she said. "I'm telling you because the others acted like they could. Like if they just smiled enough and made enough food, we'd eventually call them Mama or something." Abigail's voice was flat and controlled and had the quality of something that had been rehearsed, or at least thought through. "We're not going to do that." "I'm not asking you to." "I know you're not asking. I'm telling you it won't happen anyway." "All right." Clara lifted the spoon and checked the consistency. "Not yet." She kept stirring. "For what it's worth, Abigail, I'm not here to be your mother. I'm here to cook and keep the house and make sure you and Rose don't freeze to death in your beds. That's what I'm being paid for." Silence. Then, "That's not what she said. Mrs. Fowler, she said she wanted to be like a mother to us." "How did that work out?" A pause. "She left after 22 days. "Right." Clara stirred. "I find it's better to be honest about what a situation actually is rather than what you wish it was." Another silence, longer this time. She could feel Abigail recalibrating. "What is this situation then?" the girl asked. "According to you." Clara thought about it honestly. "Your father needed help running the house and looking after you and your sister. I needed a place to be and a way to earn my keep. We made an agreement. Within that agreement, I'm going to do my job as well as I can, which means looking after you properly. That's it." "That sounds very businesslike." "Most things that work do." She heard Abigail cross the kitchen and pull out a chair and sit down, not leaving. The girl seemed constitutionally incapable of leaving a conversation she was still thinking about. "The soap's going to smell bad," Abigail said. "It always smells bad at this stage. It smells fine when it's done." "Mrs. Fowler used to buy soap from the store in Millhaven. That costs money. Papa has money. Having money and spending it unnecessarily are different things." Clara tapped the spoon on the side of the pot. "Do you want to learn how to do this? It's useful." A long pause. Abigail pulled her chair closer. "I guess I could watch," she said. Rose was easier in some ways and more complicated in others. The not talking, or rather the selective, careful deployment of talking, as if words were something she'd decided to ration after discovering they could be taken away, this was not something Clara tried to fix. She had seen adults try to fix Rose's silences, coaxing and prompting, and filling the quiet with anxious chatter, and she'd seen the way Rose retreated from it, folding smaller, going somewhere inside herself where she could wait out the noise. Clara talked to her the same way she'd talk to anyone, practically, directly, without expectation of particular response. She told Rose what she was doing while she did it. "I'm starting the bread. The dough needs to rest for an hour. I'm going to check the garden before the frost gets the last of the root vegetables." Not to prompt conversation, but just because it seemed rude to move through spaces in silence when someone was sharing them with you. Rose started following her everywhere by the 3rd week of November. Not talking, mostly, just present. 2 steps behind, the gray stone in her pocket, watching with those serious eyes that took in everything and gave back nothing that wasn't measured first. On a cold morning in December, Clara was out at the kitchen garden doing the last of the putting to bed work, mulching the beds, pulling the dead stalks, turning the soil around the roots that would winter over, and Rose came and crouched beside her without being asked and started pulling dead stalks from the adjacent bed. They worked in silence for a while, a long while. The cold was dry and sharp, and their breath came out in small clouds. "If you plant garlic before the ground freezes," Rose said, not looking up from the dead stalks, "it comes up in spring." "That's right," Clara said. "Do you know where your father keeps the seed garlic?" "In the barn, in a crate near the east wall." "Would you get it?" Rose went and got it, and they planted garlic in 2 of the beds before the light went, and they did it without talking much. And when they came back inside, Rose's cheeks were red from the cold, and she ate an extra biscuit at lunch without being prompted. Clara told Nathan that evening. He was in the office with the door open for once, going over something in the ledger, and she stopped in the doorway and said, "Rose knows where the seed garlic is. She told me how to put it in before the frost. I didn't know she knew about gardening." Nathan set down his pen. "Her mother taught her," he said, before she left. They used to spend whole mornings out there. He looked at the ledger. I didn't know Rose remembered it. She remembered it precisely, Clara said, down to the correct depth for the cloves. He didn't say anything for a moment. She could see the particular quality of his stillness, not absence, but the opposite, a careful presence, like a man trying very hard not to move while he figured out if the ground under him was stable. Thank you for telling me, he said. She went back to the kitchen, and that was the whole of it. But the next morning, Nathan came in for breakfast 15 minutes late, and when he sat down, there was a particular quality to his face, not happy exactly, but something adjacent to it, something a little less locked than usual. And she thought maybe he'd gone out to look at the garlic beds in the early dark. She didn't ask. Some things you just noted and filed away. He checked. The letter came on a Thursday in the second week of December, carried by the Millhaven mail courier who came through the valley twice a week. Nathan took it inside without opening it. Clara saw it on the table when she came in from the woodpile, a heavy cream-colored envelope with a return address in Cheyenne, the kind of envelope that took effort to produce, the kind that lawyers sent. She left it there and started on supper. Nathan opened it after supper when the girls had gone upstairs. She heard him in the office, and then a silence that lasted long enough that she went to check the stove damper, which didn't need checking. And on the way past the office door, she saw him sitting at the desk with the letter open in front of him and both hands flat on the desktop on either side of it. She went back to the kitchen. 20 minutes later, he came in. She was washing up. He sat down at the table and didn't say anything for a moment, and she finished what she was doing and dried her hands and sat down across from him. You don't have to tell me anything, she said. I know. He picked up his coffee cup, which was empty, set it back down. It's for my late wife's mother, Vivian Sterling. She's a particular kind of person. He said it with the care of someone choosing a description that was accurate without being fully adequate. She lives in Cheyenne. She has money and a number of connections in the right offices, and she has believed since my wife left that I'm not a suitable father. Clara waited. She's filing for guardianship of the girls. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, and somewhere on the property, something was knocking against something else in a loose, irregular rhythm. A shutter latch, probably. The one on the south side of the barn that needed a new pin. On what grounds? Clara asked. The letter doesn't say specifically. It says her attorney will be in contact. He looked at the table. It also says she has a witness who will testify that He stopped, pressed his mouth into a line. That I have failed in my duties as a father, in specific and documented ways. Is that true? He looked up at her, and she met his eyes steadily, because it was a direct question, and she'd asked it directly, and she wasn't going to look away from it now. I haven't been... He stopped again, started differently. I know I'm not present in the way they need me to be. I know that. After Eleanor left, I went somewhere inside myself, and I've been trying to find my way back, and it's taken longer than it should have. He said it without self-pity, just factually, the way you report a problem you're in the middle of solving. But I have not neglected them. I have not harmed them. I have not failed them in any way that Vivian Sterling can put in front of a judge and make stick. Does Vivian Sterling know that? His jaw tightened. Vivian Sterling knows what she wants to know. Clara looked at the table between them. She thought about the oilcloth in the pantry, the papers she'd seen and looked away from, the words, petition for guardianship in a law office letterhead. She thought about Rose in the kitchen doorway saying, I don't know which one is right. She thought about Abigail's armor, built piece by piece, fitted to every vulnerable point. What happens if she succeeds? Clara asked. She takes the girls to Cheyenne, Nathan said, raises them in her house on her terms, with her money, until they're old enough for her to marry off to someone she's already chosen. He said it quietly, but the quietness had something in it, something that was not quiet at all. She hated me from the day Eleanor brought me home. She's always believed the girls belonged to her, not to us. And Eleanor? Does she have any say in this? Something shifted in his face. Eleanor left 2 years ago, he said. It wasn't a natural leaving. She and I were having difficulties that I don't intend to go into, and she made a decision, and she's somewhere now that I don't know, and neither does Vivian, and Vivian blames me for that too. Clara sat with that. There were things in it she didn't understand yet. the shape of the marriage, what the difficulties had been, where Eleanor Cross actually was, and why she'd left her children. And she understood that Nathan was not going to go further into it tonight, or possibly ever. "You'll need a lawyer," she said. "I know. A good one. Not someone from Millhaven. I know that too." He looked at the envelope. "I have one in mind. A man named Garrett in Rawlins. He handled a land dispute for me 3 years ago. He's careful, and he's not afraid of money." "Good." Clara stood up and took the empty coffee cup and refilled it from the pot, even though it was late for coffee, and he probably didn't need it, because her hands wanted something to do. She set it back in front of him. "Nathan." She used his first name for the first time since she'd arrived. He didn't react to it, but she noticed him not reacting, which was its own kind of notice. "I don't think Vivian Sterling has ever spent time in this house. I don't think she knows what it actually looks like from the inside." He looked up at her. "I've been here 2 months," she said. "And what I can tell you, from the inside, is that your daughters are fed and clothed and warm. Rose planted garlic this week because she remembered something her mother taught her and she wanted to. Abigail is learning to make soap. They're not happy in the way happy children are supposed to look. But they're not broken either." She paused. "A judge who looks at the actual evidence is not going to give Vivian Sterling what she's asking for." He held her gaze for a long moment. "And if she makes sure the judge doesn't look at actual evidence?" Clara pressed her lips together. "Then we'll have a harder problem," she said. "But let's start with the easier one first." She went to bed that night with the weight of it sitting somewhere in her sternum, not heavy enough to be fear yet, just present, like the sound of that shutter latch knocking in the wind. Irregular, insistent, a problem waiting to become a real problem. Christmas came and went quietly. Clara made a proper dinner, roast chicken, because there was no beef to spare, and potato pie, and a dried apple cake that used the last of the cinnamon. And Nathan came in from the morning chores, and the 4 of them sat at the table and ate. And at some point during the meal, Abigail told a story about the rooster that made Rose laugh. And it was the kind of laugh that surprised the room, bright and sudden, like a crack in ice, like something breaking open. Nathan stopped eating. He looked at Rose laughing, and something moved through his face that Clara looked away from, because it was too private to witness directly. She looked at her plate and let the laugh fill the room and didn't say anything. After dinner, when Nathan had gone to check on the horses, and the girls had gone to their room to look at the things they'd found wrapped in paper that morning, nothing elaborate, hair ribbons for Rose, a new journal for Abigail, who was always filling up the margins of things with her cramped handwriting. Clara sat at the table with her coffee and thought about Thomas. She let herself do it properly, the way she usually didn't have time for. She thought about the Christmas they'd spent in the first year of the homestead, which had been cold and underfunded, and still somehow the best Christmas she could remember. Thomas making a terrible and sincere attempt at a plum pudding from a recipe his mother had sent in a letter. The pudding catching fire briefly, both of them laughing in the kitchen of the drafty cabin at Castor's Creek. She thought about Lily on the Christmas after that, 8 months old, profoundly unimpressed by everything she was shown, but very interested in a piece of ribbon tied around a package. She held it for a while, not trying to set it down yet. Then she washed the Christmas dishes and set the kitchen to rights and went to check the firewood situation, because the temperature was dropping and the girls' room got cold on the north side. The new year came in hard and cold and brought trouble with it, as New Year's in Wyoming tended to do. In the second week of January, a man came to the ranch. Clara saw him from the kitchen window, a heavy-set figure on a dark horse, sitting at the end of the gravel drive in a way that wasn't looking for the gate, but was looking at the house. Just sitting. She watched him for a few minutes, and he didn't move, and then he turned the horse and rode back the way he'd come, east toward the Millhaven Road. She told Nathan at lunch. He put down his fork. What did he look like? Heavy-set, dark coat. The horse was a bay with a white sock on the left foreleg. He sat there for about 5 minutes, just looking at the house, then rode east. Nathan's face did the thing it did when he was doing calculations. I don't know who that is, he said, but the way he said it meant he had guesses. Has Garrett sent any word from Rawlins? A letter last week. The hearing is set for March. Vivian's attorney is a man named Crew. He's expensive. He picked up his fork again, but didn't use it. Crew has won 4 custody cases in the last 2 years in Laramie County. All 4 went to the petitioning party. That's 4, Clara said. Not all of them. You're optimistic. I'm practical, she said. 4 wins means he's also had losses. We need to know how. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not quite surprise, not quite assessment. Something between the two. Like she'd said something that didn't fit the category he'd put her in, and he was quietly revising the category. I'll ask Garrett to look into it, he said. The man on the dark horse came back 2 days later. This time he didn't sit at the end of the drive. This time he came up to the gate. Clara was in the yard bringing wood in when he arrived. She set the wood down and turned to face him. He was at the gate on the other side, one hand on the crossbar, looking at her with the flat assessment of someone who has been sent to do a job and is figuring out how to do it. Is Cross here? He said. Mr. Cross is working, she said. Can I take a message? You his wife? I'm the housekeeper. She crossed her arms. The cold was bitter, but she didn't show it. You can leave your name and your business, and I'll make sure he gets it. The man's eyes moved over the house, over the yard, over her. You tell him Vivian Sterling sends her regards, he said, and that she's thinking of the children. I'll tell him, Clara said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he turned the horse and went back down the road. She stood in the yard until he was out of sight, her jaw set, the cold air burning in her lungs, and thought, this is what it looks like when it starts. She brought the wood in. She made lunch. She told Nathan at the table, calmly and in detail, exactly what the man had said and how he'd looked at the house. And she watched Nathan's face go very still in the particular way it did when he was keeping something contained. He's a hand of Cruz, Nathan said, or someone Vivian hired directly. It doesn't matter which. He was mapping the place, Clara said, looking for things. I know. Abigail was at the table. She'd been supposed to be upstairs doing her arithmetic, but she'd come down for water and then somehow ended up staying, and she was sitting very still now, pencil still in her hand, pretending she wasn't listening to every word. Nathan noticed. He looked at his daughter across the table, and something in his face changed. The containment softened, just slightly, into something that was trying very hard to be reassuring without making promises it couldn't keep. Abigail, he said. She looked up. Her expression was the armor expression, the one that had taken her 2 years to perfect. But underneath it, and it was underneath it, Claire could see the thing that the armor was covering, a child who was terrified. This is going to be all right, Nathan said. And then he stopped and looked at the table because he'd said the thing he'd been told, the thing they'd all agreed, was not safe to say. Abigail put down her pencil. You don't know that, she said. No, he said. I don't, but I'm fighting. Do you understand? I'm fighting. He said it simply, without theatrics. Vivian isn't going to get what she wants. I need you to trust me on that. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes, Clara had started to realize. Or what she imagined Eleanor Cross's eyes must have looked like, based on the photograph she'd noticed once on the mantel and never seen Nathan look at directly. Okay, Abigail said. One word, measured. It was the most trust Clara had heard her give anyone in 2 months. What? 3 weeks before the March hearing, a letter arrived that none of them had expected. It was addressed to Nathan, in handwriting he recognized. His hands went strange when he picked it up, gone white at the knuckles for a moment before he got control of them again. He read it in the office with the door closed, and when he came out, he had the look of a man who had just discovered that the ground he thought was gone had turned out to be there after all, just further down than he'd been able to see. Eleanor wrote, he said. Clara was at the table mending one of Rose's dresses. She looked up and waited. She's in Denver, he said. She's been there since she left. He stopped. He had the letter in his hand and he kept looking at it and looking away from it. She heard about the custody hearing. Someone she knows in Cheyenne told her. She says, he had to clear his throat. She says she'll come to testify against her mother. The kitchen was very quiet. She says her mother manipulated the situation when she left, Nathan continued. That Vivian told Eleanor things about me, about the marriage, that weren't true and encouraged her to leave. And then he set the letter on the table. Then used the leaving against me. Clara looked at the letter on the table. She thought about Rose saying, "I don't know which one is right." She thought about Abigail's armor, and the photograph on the mantel that Nathan never looked at, and the closed room upstairs, and the particular quality of Nathan's guilt. Not the guilt of a man who had done damage, but the guilt of a man who had been told he'd done damage and believed it long enough that the belief had become its own kind of damage. "Does she know how the girls are?" Clara asked. "I don't know what she knows." He picked up the letter again. "She asks about them. She asks if they're all right. Are you going to write back?" He stood at the table for a moment. He had the letter, and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the January wind pushed at the house with that particular Wyoming persistence, finding every gap, testing every joint. "Yes," he said. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't anything as clean as that. Clara understood this territory by now, the hard country between what happened to a person and what they eventually made of it, and she knew there were no straight lines through it. But it was something. A door that had been nailed shut for 2 years, cracked open. She went back to mending the dress. The needle pulled the thread through the worn cotton, stitch by stitch, and she listened to Nathan go back to the office and the creak of his chair and the sound of him opening a desk drawer. And she thought that whatever happened next, the hearing, Vivian Sterling and her expensive lawyer, the man on the dark horse with his flat eyes and his employer's regards, they were at least not going into it the same way they'd been going into it before. Something had shifted. And something that had shifted could, if you were careful and honest and didn't drop it, become something to stand on. Eleanor's letter changed the temperature of the house in ways that were hard to name precisely. Nathan didn't tell the girls about it. Clara understood why. There was no version of that conversation that didn't require explaining things a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old shouldn't have to hold. Not yet. Not with the hearing still weeks away and the outcome still genuinely uncertain. So the letter stayed in the office desk, and Nathan went about his days with a slightly different quality to his silence, less sealed somehow. Like a window that had been painted shut for years, and someone had finally worked the latch free, even if the window itself hadn't opened yet. Clara wrote back to Garrett and Rollins the same week, with Nathan's permission, outlining what she knew of the household and what she'd observed in 3 months at Silver Ridge. Garrett had requested written accounts from anyone who could speak to Nathan's conduct as a father. She wrote it at the kitchen table in the evenings, 3 drafts before she was satisfied, and when she read the final version back to herself, she thought, "This is true. Every sentence of this is true," which was the only standard she held herself to. She wrote about the horses. She wrote about the ledger and the hands paid on time. She wrote about the garlic beds and Rose's precise knowledge of planting depths. She wrote about Abigail's journal, which was now on its 2nd volume, and the way Nathan had quietly put a new one on the kitchen table without saying anything, as if it had simply appeared. She wrote about suppers and firewood and the particular steadiness of a man who was struggling and knew it and was still, every single day, there. She sealed the letter and gave it to the mail courier and didn't think about it anymore. What she'd written was true. What happened with true things in front of judges was not something she could control. What she could control was the household, and so that's what she focused on. February in Wyoming was the month that tested everything. The cold came down from the north with a seriousness that October had only hinted at, and the house became a smaller, more compressed place. Everyone inside more, everyone's edges showing more clearly. The ranch hands confined to shorter work days, the horses restless in the barn, even the rooster subdued, presiding over a hen yard gone quiet under 6 inches of packed snow. Rose had started sleeping with the gray stone under her pillow. Clara discovered this by accident one morning when she was straightening the bed, and she put the stone back where she'd found it and said nothing. Abigail had filled the 2nd journal by the end of January and was into a 3rd that she'd acquired herself somehow, trading something with one of the ranch hand's sons who came by occasionally to help with the heavier winter chores. Clara didn't ask what she'd traded. You didn't ask Abigail about her transactions. The girl operated on a barter economy that was entirely her own and functioned with considerable efficiency. It was Abigail who found out about the witnesses. She overheard it, which was a talent she'd cultivated. Clara had noticed early that Abigail had a gift for being present in places without appearing to be present. A stillness she'd developed, probably, from years of trying to read rooms that the adults in her life were actively trying to close to her. On a Tuesday afternoon in early February, she had been on the landing above the main hall reading, While Nathan spoke in the office below with a man from Millhaven named Perdue, who occasionally did work on the property. Perdue had been talking to someone in town. Abigail came to find Clara in the kitchen, moving with a speed and directness that meant something had broken through the armor. "Crew has a witness," she said. "Someone in Millhaven. Someone who's going to say things about Papa." Clara set down the pot she was holding. "How do you know this?" "I heard Mr. Perdue telling Papa." She was working to keep her voice level and not quite succeeding. Perdue heard it from someone at the feed store. That Crew's man came to Millhaven last week and talked to... She stopped, swallowed. "He talked to a woman named Greta Morse, Mrs. Morse. She used to know Mama." "What is Mrs. Morse going to say?" "I don't know. I didn't hear all of it." Abigail's hands were balled at her sides. But Perdue looked sorry when he was telling Papa. The way people look when they're telling you something bad. Clara considered. "Where's your father now?" "Still in the office. He closed the door after Perdue left." She left the pot on the counter and went to the office and knocked. A pause. Then, "Come in." Nathan was at the desk. He had not been going over the ledger or writing anything. He'd just been sitting there, and the letter from Rollins and the original letter from Vivian's attorney were both on the desk in front of him, flattened out, like he'd been comparing them. "Abigail told me about Mrs. Morse," Clara said. He looked up. His face had the expression of a man who had been hoping this particular problem would be slightly smaller than it was turning out to be. "She wasn't supposed to hear that." "She's 12, and this is her life," Clara said. "She hears most things." She came in and sat down in the chair across from the desk. Not the visitor's chair on the far wall, the closer one, the chair she'd started claiming whenever they needed to have a real conversation. "Who is Greta Morse?" Nathan rubbed his jaw. "She was a friend of Eleanor's. They grew up together, the three of them, Eleanor, Greta, and Vivian. She's loyal to Vivian in the way that some women are loyal to women who have been good to them financially." He said it without contempt, just fact. Her husband died 4 years ago. Vivian helped her keep the house. What can she say? She can say things she saw, or things she thinks she saw, or things Vivian has told her to say she saw. He picked up a pen and set it back down. "In the winter 2 years ago, when things between Eleanor and me were at their worst, I was not a good version of myself. I was drinking more than I should have. I raised my voice in ways I shouldn't have. I did not hit anyone, I did not harm anyone, but Greta Morse was in this house twice during that period, and she saw things she could characterize however Vivian tells her to characterize them." Clara looked at the desk between them. "Did Garrett know about this?" "I told him there might be character witnesses. I didn't tell him about that winter specifically." He set both hands flat on the desk, the same posture she'd seen him in the night the first letter arrived. "I was ashamed of it." "I understand that," Clara said, "but Garrett needs to know now. If Crew puts Greta Morse on the stand and Garrett doesn't know what's coming, he can't prepare a response." "I know. Today," she said. "Write to him today." He looked at her. There was something in his expression she had come to recognize by now, not resentment of being directed, more like the particular relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for long enough that having someone else put their hands on it, even briefly, was more of a comfort than they wanted to admit. "Today," he said. Titans. She found the man in the barn. It was a Thursday, mid-February, and Nathan had gone to Rollins to meet with Garrett in person. The first time the two of them had sat in the same room since the hearing was formally filed. He'd left before dawn. The ranch hands were out on the north pasture, clearing a fence line that had been buried under a drift. Clara had sent the girls to the house of a family named Sutter, 3 miles east, whose daughter was Abigail's age, and who had offered to have them for the afternoon to give the girls a change of scenery. She'd stayed behind to do a full cleaning of the kitchen, the kind that required moving the heavy stove out from the wall, and she was in the middle of this when she heard the barn door, not the front door, the side door, which was never used because the latch had been unreliable since November. It should have been latched from inside. She set down the brush she was holding and stood still and listened. Footsteps inside the barn. Not horses. She knew the sound of horses shifting in their stalls. Footsteps. Deliberate, moving through the barn toward the far end. She picked up the fire iron from beside the kitchen stove. She was not thinking about being brave or not being brave. She was thinking practically. Nathan was not here, the hands were not here, the girls were not here, and there was a man in the barn who had come through a door he should not have been able to open, and he was either looking for something or waiting. She went out through the back kitchen door and came around the side of the house, keeping close to the wall, and then crossed the open space to the barn's side door in the cold, with the fire iron in her right hand and the wind cutting through her coat like it wasn't there. She pushed the side door open. The man was at the far end, near the tack room. He was heavy-set, dark coat, the man from the road, the one who had delivered Vivian's regards at the gate in January. He was looking through the tack room door, and on the barn floor near his feet there was a small leather satchel that was open. He turned when he heard her. He looked at the fire iron. He did not look particularly surprised, which suggested he had dealt with situations like this before, or he was good at not showing that he was surprised, either of which told her something useful. "You shouldn't be here," Claire said. "Easy now." He raised one hand, a pacifying gesture. "I'm not here to cause trouble. You're in my employer's barn through a door you broke the latch on. That's the definition of trouble." She kept the fire iron level and her feet apart, and she was aware that he was bigger than her by a significant margin, and also aware that she had thought about this kind of calculation before, in the weeks on the road, and had come to the conclusion that size was a significant but not decisive factor. "What's in the satchel?" He glanced at the satchel on the floor. Something shifted in his calculation. "Nothing that matters," he said. "Nothing that's going to hurt anybody." "Open it and show me." He looked at her steadily. "You know who sent me?" "I can guess." "Open the satchel." He crouched slowly and opened the satchel wider and turned it so she could see. Inside were papers, several pages of handwritten notes, and what looked like a ledger page folded. She didn't recognize the ledger page from 10 feet away, but something about it felt wrong, felt planted. "You put that in the tack room," she said, "and then you were going to tell someone it was already there." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Get out," she said. "Take the satchel. Take all of it. And tell whoever sent you that the next person who comes through a door on this property uninvited is going to have a significantly worse afternoon than you're having." He stood up. He was looking at her with the flat, measuring expression she recognized from January, but there was something in it now. A recalibration. Like the category he'd put her in was proving insufficient. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I've had a hard year," Clara said. "I'm accustomed to it. Get out." He picked up the satchel. He walked the length of the barn toward the side door, passing within 6 feet of her, and she turned with him and kept the fire iron between them and held his gaze until he was through the door and she heard his boots on the frozen ground going away, then the sound of a horse, then nothing. She stood in the barn for a minute. Her hands were not shaking. She was vaguely surprised by this, and then not surprised. She had been shaking the whole time on the inside, that particular cold trembling that was the body dealing with adrenaline, but her hands had stayed steady, and that was the important part. She fixed the latch on the side door with a piece of wire, which was not a proper repair, but it would hold until Nathan got back. She put the fire iron back in the kitchen. She finished moving the stove and cleaned behind it and pushed it back and scrubbed the stovetop, and by the time the girls came back from the Sutters, she had started supper, and the kitchen smelled like onions and browning meat, and everything looked exactly as it had when the morning started. She told Nathan that night, all of it, the side door, the man, the satchel, the folded ledger page. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You confronted him alone," he said. "There wasn't anyone else here to do it. You could have—" He stopped, started again. "You should have stayed in the house. He would have planted whatever was in that satchel, and we'd be walking into the hearing with false evidence against us." She kept her voice level. "I wasn't going to let that happen." He looked at the table, then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite any single thing. Not gratitude, not alarm, not the complicated admiration she'd seen before when she'd done something that didn't fit the category. A combination of all of them, and underneath it, something that was simply, quietly real. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, no elaboration, but he said them like he meant all the weight of them. "Write to Garrett tomorrow," she said. "He needs to know that Crew is willing to plant evidence. It changes what kind of opponent we're dealing with." "It confirms it," Nathan said. I already knew what kind of opponent we were dealing with. 2 weeks before the hearing, Abigail stopped sleeping. Not entirely. She slept in fractured pieces, an hour here, 2 hours there, and Clara knew because the floorboards of the old house were honest about weight and movement, and she could hear the restless back and forth from Abigail's room in the hours between midnight and 4. She said nothing about it for a few days, waiting to see if it resolved itself. It didn't. On a Saturday morning, she brought 2 cups of coffee to the kitchen table before Abigail came downstairs, and when the girl appeared, she looked at the 2 cups and then at Clara with the expression of someone who has been caught in something they didn't know was visible. "Sit down," Clara said. "Drink that." "I don't drink coffee." "Today you do." Abigail sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it. Under her eyes, there were the particular shadows that come from accumulated sleeplessness, a bruised, fragile quality that made her look younger than 12, and also, in some specific way, much older. "I keep thinking about Cheyenne," Abigail said. "Tell me what you think about." "Grandmother's house." The word grandmother came out with a particular flatness, like a title she was reading off a document rather than anything that meant warmth. "I've been there twice. It's very big and very clean, and she has a woman who comes every day to keep it clean and another woman who cooks, and she has a parlor with furniture that you're not supposed to sit on." She turned the cup. "She always smells like lavender water, and she always says the right things, and it's the loneliest place I've ever been." Clara said nothing. "Rose doesn't remember it," Abigail said. "She was 5 the last time, but I remember. Grandmother looked at us like we were things she owned, things she'd been denied." She paused. "I don't want to go there. I know that's what I'm supposed to want because she's family and she has money and Papa has been—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Papa hasn't been perfect. I know that, but he's Papa." "What does Rose think?" Clara asked. "Rose is scared," Abigail said simply. "She won't say it, but she holds her stone all the time now. She held it through supper last Tuesday. I don't think she let go of it once." Clara looked at her coffee cup. "Abigail, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as information, not as comfort. There's a difference." Abigail looked up. "What I've seen in this house," Clara said, "what I've seen in 4 months, your father is not a perfect man. He's had a hard 2 years, and he made some choices in the worst of those years that he's ashamed of, and he spent a long time paying for them inside himself. But what I've seen is a man who shows up, every day, who fixed the thing you told me was broken before I could put it on a list, who put a new journal on the table because he noticed you'd filled the last one." She paused. "Those things don't make a man perfect. They make him real. And a real father fighting for his children is not nothing." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "What if the judge doesn't see that?" "Then we make sure he does," Clara said. "That's what the hearing is for. You're going to testify. If Garrett thinks it'll help, yes." Abigail turned the cup again. "What will you say?" "The truth. The same truth I wrote to Garrett in January. What I've seen, what I know, what I can stand behind." "And if Crew tries to make you look bad on the stand?" Clara almost smiled. "He can try." Something shifted in Abigail's face. The slow, reluctant movement of something that had been braced for impact and was cautiously standing down. She picked up the coffee cup and took a sip and made a face at the bitterness. "It's terrible," she said. "It is," Clara agreed. "Drink it anyway." "What?" Eleanor Cross arrived on a Wednesday, 5 days before the hearing. Nathan had gone to meet her at the Mill Haven stage, alone, which Clara understood, and which the girls did not know about yet, which was a conversation Nathan had said he needed to have with them himself, and that Clara was grateful not to be present for. She knew Eleanor was coming by the way the day felt different, a particular tension in the house, the kind that precedes something that cannot be undone once it starts. She kept the girls occupied. Rose was helping her put up the last of the winter preserves, pressing wax seals onto jars, and Abigail was at the table doing arithmetic with a diligence she did not normally bring to arithmetic, which meant she was doing arithmetic so she wouldn't have to think about something else. Nathan came back mid-afternoon, alone. He came in through the front door and went straight to the office and closed the door, and Clara kept doing what she was doing and didn't go after him. 20 minutes later, he came out and into the kitchen and stood in the doorway. "She's at the hotel in Millhaven," he said. "She'll be at the hearing on Monday." Abigail had stopped pretending to do arithmetic. She was looking at her father with an expression Clara could not fully read. Too many things in it, layered, compressed. "Does she want to see us?" Abigail asked. Nathan looked at his daughter. He had clearly been asking himself the same question and had an answer that he was trying to figure out how to deliver. "She asked if she could," he said. "I told her that was your decision, yours and Rose's." Rose looked up from the jar she was sealing. She had the gray stone in her left hand and the wax seal in her right, and she was looking at her father with those serious, absorbing eyes. "Is she okay?" Rose asked. Nathan went very still for a moment. She's all right," he said. "She's been in Denver. She's been well." "Does she know about the hearing?" "That's why she came, sweetheart." Rose pressed the wax seal onto the jar. She looked at it carefully. "Okay," she said. Abigail pushed back from the table and walked out of the kitchen. Her footsteps went upstairs. A door, not slammed, which was its own kind of statement from a girl who had the ability to slam things extremely effectively, closed quietly. Nathan looked at Clara. "Give her tonight," Clara said quietly. "She'll come back to it." He nodded. He looked like a man who had been carrying several extremely heavy things in separate hands for a very long time and was just beginning to understand that some of them needed to be set down before he could deal with the others. "There's something else," he said. He glanced at Rose, who had gone back to her jars with the deliberate focus of a child deciding not to hear something. He looked at Clara. "Garrett spoke to Eleanor this morning before I arrived. She told him things about Vivian, about why she left." He paused. "Vivian told Eleanor that I was planning to have her declared unfit, that I had documentation, that if she didn't leave voluntarily, I would have her removed from the children's lives permanently." He said it flatly, the way he said things he was still processing. None of that was true. There was no documentation, no plan. I never considered it, but Eleanor believed her. Her mother told her this, and she believed it, and she left. Pop on. Clara stood very still. "Vivian maneuvered her own daughter out of this house," Nathan said, "and then used the leaving to try to take the children." He pressed the heel of his hand against the doorframe. 2 years. The girls have been without their mother for 2 years because Vivian wanted them in Cheyenne. The kitchen was quiet. Rose was very still at the table, both hands on the jar, not pressing the seal anymore, just holding it. "Rose," Clara said gently. Rose looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't happiness. "Why don't you go check on Abigail?" Clara said. "She might want company." Rose got down from the chair. She paused at the kitchen doorway and looked at her father. "Papa," she said. "Yeah, sweetheart." "You didn't make Mama go?" He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and crouched down in front of her, and he put his hands on her shoulders and he looked her in the face. "No," he said. "I didn't." Rose looked at him for a long moment with that searching, measuring gaze. Then she nodded once, the same way he nodded when he'd decided something, Clara noticed. The family resemblance in that gesture. She went upstairs. Nathan stayed crouched on the kitchen floor for a moment after she was gone, hands on his knees, head down. Clara turned back to the stove. She gave him the space to be wherever he was. That was what she could do. After a moment, she heard him get up. "Supper in an hour," she said. "Right," he said. And she heard him go back to the office and the sound of the chair, and then the sound of him writing, the scratch of pen on paper, faster than he normally wrote, like something that had been stopped up for a long time was finally finding its way out. On the Friday before the hearing, Garrett came to Silver Ridge. He was a small, compact man in his late 50s with a neat gray beard and the kind of eyes that reminded Clara of a watchmaker, precise, patient, missing nothing. He sat at the kitchen table with Nathan and Clara for 3 hours that afternoon, going over testimony, witnesses, the architecture of Crews' likely approach, and their own response to it. He'd looked surprised when Nathan included Clara in the meeting. He hadn't said so, but she'd seen it. He didn't look surprised by the end of the 3 hours. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said as he was packing his papers back into his case, "when Crew questions you, and he will question you carefully because you're their strongest witness to Nathan's character, he is going to try to establish that you have a personal interest in the outcome." Because of my living arrangement, Clara said. Because of your living arrangement, Garrett confirmed. He said it without judgment or implication. He'll suggest you have reasons beyond professional ones to want Nathan to retain custody. What do I say? You say you were hired as a housekeeper on a 30-day trial and that you've been paid wages for your work, and that your testimony reflects what you've observed in a professional capacity. He paused. Then he'll ask if your feelings for the family have remained purely professional. And? Garrett looked at her steadily. Then you tell the truth. Whatever the truth is. Clara held his gaze. The truth is that I came to Silver Ridge with nothing, and I've been treated fairly. I've watched a man work to be better for his children every day for 4 months. I've watched those children grow. What I feel about that is, it's not nothing, but it doesn't change what I've seen. What I've seen is what it is whether I care about it or not. Garrett nodded slowly. Say exactly that, he said. Don't change a word of it. He left before supper. Nathan walked him out and came back in and sat down at the table. He thinks we can win, Nathan said. I know, Clara said. I watched his face. He's not certain. Nobody's certain of anything worth doing. She started clearing the table. But we've got Eleanor, and we've got the truth, and Crew has got a woman Vivian paid and a satchel full of fabricated evidence that he doesn't know we know about. Nathan was quiet for a moment. That man in the barn, he said. You handled that alone. You weren't here. I know I wasn't here. He looked at her across the table. That's not... I wasn't criticizing. I'm aware that things happen when I'm not here that require someone to handle them. He paused. I'm aware that you've been handling them. Clara set the plates in the basin. That's what I'm here for. Clara, she turned. He was looking at her with an expression that had too many things in it to read cleanly. Not the glass window distance she'd seen at the beginning, not the careful containment, not the guarded watchfulness. Something more direct than all of that. Something that had been working its way to the surface for a while and was not entirely ready to arrive, but was arriving anyway. After Monday, he said. After this is settled? He stopped. I'd like to talk about what comes next. She looked at him for a moment. After Monday, she said. We'll talk. Outside, the February wind had gone quiet for once, and the ranch was still in the early dark. And somewhere in the house above them, she could hear the sound of Abigail and Rose moving between rooms, talking in the low voices of sisters. And it was such an ordinary sound that it almost stopped her heart. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were steady. Monday was coming, and they were as ready as they were going to be. The courthouse in Rawlins was a 2-story stone building that smelled of old paper and wood oil, and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult things happened regularly. It had tall, narrow windows that let in the February light at an angle that made everything look slightly more severe than it actually was, or possibly exactly as severe as it actually was. Clara had been in courtrooms before, once as a witness to a property dispute in Castor's Creek, once when Thomas had needed to file a deed, and she had the same feeling now she'd had then, that the room itself was indifferent to outcome, that it would hold whatever happened with exactly the same wooden patience, and that this was either reassuring or terrible depending on how you looked at it. They had come in 2 wagons, arriving the night before the Monday hearing. Nathan and Garrett in one set of conversations at the hotel. The girls with Clara in 2 rooms on the 2nd floor with a connecting door that Rose kept open so she could see from one room into the other. Abigail had not slept again. Clara had heard her through the wall, but she'd come down to breakfast that morning with her hair braided correctly and her back straight and a look on her face that said she had decided how she was going to be today, and that was how she was going to be. Eleanor was staying at the hotel as well. Nathan had told the girls this the night before, quietly, in the room with the connecting door open. The conversation had been brief and not easy, and Clara had been present for it at Nathan's request, though she'd sat near the window and let him do the talking. Abigail had said, "Is she going to sit with us?" "That's up to you," Nathan said. "She wants to. I told her it was your decision." A long silence. Rose was holding the gray stone. "She can sit with us," Rose said, "if she wants." Abigail had looked at her sister and then at the floor and then given a short nod that communicated about 17 different things simultaneously and settled none of them. Eleanor Cross was waiting in the courthouse lobby when they arrived. Clara had formed no particular picture of her. She'd deliberately avoided doing that, because she'd found that pictures formed in advance of people were almost always wrong in one direction or another, and only got in the way. What she saw was a woman in her mid-30s, dark-haired like Abigail, with a fine-boned quality to her face and eyes that had been crying recently and were working very hard not to be crying now. She was dressed well, but not expensively, a dark green traveling dress that had seen some wear, and she was standing with her hands clasped in front of her in the posture of someone who has decided not to run and is holding themselves to that decision actively. She looked at Nathan first. Something passed between them that Clara looked away from. Not because it was romantic, there was nothing romantic in it, but because it was private in the way that only things between people who have damaged each other can be private. Then Eleanor looked at the girls. Rose crossed the lobby and put her arms around her mother's waist. Eleanor made a sound that was not a word. She put both arms around Rose and held her, and her face went through several things in quick succession that she did not try to control. Abigail stayed where she was for a moment. Then she walked forward and stood at the edge of the embrace, and Eleanor reached out one arm and drew her in, and Abigail let herself be drawn, and the armor, the careful, 2-year construction, developed, visibly, a crack. Nathan was looking at the window. Clara stood beside him. "All right?" she said quietly. "No," he said, just as quietly. "But that doesn't matter right now." "It'll matter later." "Later," he agreed. Garrett appeared at the courthouse door, and the morning began. Vivian Sterling was already in the courtroom. She was a tall woman, late 60s, with white hair dressed with precision and a quality of stillness that was the opposite of Nathan's stillness. His came from containment, hers from the settled certainty of someone who had spent decades getting what she wanted and had stopped questioning whether this would be different. She wore black, which Clara noted, and she sat at the petitioner's table with her attorney Crew on her left and a woman Clara recognized, from the description, from the posture, as Greta Morse on her right. Crew was younger than Clara had expected, early 40s, with a neat dark suit and the kind of face that was arranged for pleasantness without actually being pleasant, a professional expression he'd clearly developed and maintained the way some men maintain their boots. He had papers organized before him with evident precision, and he glanced at Garrett's table when they came in with the brief, measured look of someone assessing competition. The judge was a man named Holt. He came in without ceremony and sat and looked at the room with the expression of a man who had heard a great many cases and been surprised by very few of them, and was reserving judgment on whether this would be one of the exceptions. He was not unkind. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Not warm, not inclined to make anything easier than it needed to be, but not the kind of man who'd decided the outcome before he'd heard it. She filed that away. The morning began with Crew. He was good, which she had expected. He was methodical, and he was patient, and he had an approach that Clara recognized after the first 20 minutes. He wasn't trying to prove that Nathan was a monster. He was trying to prove that Nathan was insufficient, that the girls deserved better resources, better social standing, better stability than a widower on a frontier ranch could provide. He was building, carefully, a picture of deprivation, not dramatic, not abusive, just quietly and persistently inadequate. He put Greta Morse on the stand first. Mrs. Morse was a small woman with a nervous quality she was trying to suppress, and she answered Crew's questions in a voice that stayed close to the facts whenever the facts were safe and edged into interpretation when Crew needed interpretation. She spoke about the winter 2 years ago. She spoke about seeing Nathan in a state of agitation. She spoke about the girls looking thin, which Clara noted was not a lie on its face. The girls had been thin when Clara arrived, and about a house that was not well maintained. Garrett cross-examined her carefully and without hostility. He established that she had visited twice in that winter, for a total of perhaps 4 hours. He established that Vivian Sterling was her primary source of income since her husband's death. He asked her what she knew of Vivian's reasons for the petition. "I just know she loves those girls," Mrs. Morse said. "And Mr. Cross?" Garrett said. "In your observation, does he love his daughters?" A pause. I'm sure he does, in his way." "In his way," Garrett repeated. He let it sit there for a moment, and then he said he had no further questions, and the particular quality of "in his way" remained in the room like a smell. Crew called 2 more witnesses, a man from Mill Haven who had done some business with Nathan and found him difficult, which was the most tepid testimony Clara had ever heard, and clearly even Crew had limited expectations for it. And a woman from the county office in Rawlins who spoke in general terms about the resources available to children in Vivian Sterling's custody versus a single-parent household. The county woman was efficient and impersonal and not lying, technically, about any of it. And she was probably the most effective of the three because she had no particular investment in the outcome and therefore sounded the most credible. By the noon recess, Clara had a clearer picture of what Crew was doing and a clear sense that Garrett had seen it too, because the questions he asked in Cross had all been pulling at the same thread. The gap between what witnesses had been told and what they had personally observed. In the recess, they sat in a small anteroom off the main hall, all of them, awkwardly arranged. Nathan and Garrett at the table with papers, Clara on one side, Eleanor on the other, the girls in the two chairs against the wall. It should have been terrible. It was merely uncomfortable, which under the circumstances was almost a kind of accomplishment. Rose had not let go of the stone all morning. She had it in her coat pocket and her hand in her pocket, and Clara could see the slight movement of her thumb working across the surface of it. "Are we losing?" Abigail asked. She directed it at Garrett. "No," Garrett said. He said it without the softening people use when they're not sure. "We're listening to their case. Our case comes this afternoon." "What Mrs. Morse said about Papa is going to look very different," Garrett said, "when measured against what other people say about him, including people who have spent considerably more than 4 hours in this house." Abigail looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. "Eat something," she said. "There's bread in that bag. You haven't eaten since this morning." "I'm not hungry." "That's not the same as not needing food." "Eat." Abigail ate. Rose ate too, mechanically, hand still in her pocket. Nathan was looking at the papers. Eleanor was looking at nothing in particular. At one point their eyes met across the table, and she said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, Nathan." And he said equally quietly, "I know." And that was all. It was not forgiveness, and it was not resumption, and it was not nothing either. It was two people putting something down for long enough to get through what they needed to get through. Clara thought about Thomas. She thought he would have liked this family, the specific difficulty of it. He'd have liked that it was hard. She ate her bread and waited for the afternoon. Garrett put Nathan on the stand first. He was not a naturally comfortable witness. He was too contained for that, too accustomed to keeping things in, and the stand required a person to open up in a room full of strangers, which was the opposite of everything he was built for. Clara watched him make the adjustment, visibly and imperfectly, shoulders moving as he settled himself, jaw working once before he locked it down. Garrett took him through the ranch, the operational details first, which were easy, which Nathan could talk about without self-consciousness, because they were facts and facts were manageable. The acreage, the livestock, the income, the hands employed, and for how long. The house, its condition, its capacity, what had been maintained, and what needed attention, and what had been addressed since Clara's arrival. Then the harder ground. "Mr. Cross," Garrett said, "you've heard Mrs. Morse's testimony about the winter 2 years ago. Were you, as she described, in a state of agitation on those occasions?" "Yes," Nathan said. "Were you drinking?" "More than I should have been." "Were your daughters fed and clothed and physically cared for during this period?" "Yes." "Were they ever harmed?" "No." "Were they ever in a situation of physical danger due to your behavior?" "No." Crew objected to the line of questioning on grounds of self-serving testimony. Judge Holt sustained the objection, and Garrett pivoted without breaking stride. "Mr. Cross, in the 2 years since your wife left, what changes have you made in how you manage this household?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. The quiet was not evasion. It was a man deciding how to be honest in a way that was also specific. "I hired better help," he said. "I was slower to do that than I should have been. I didn't want people in the house. After Eleanor left, I didn't want anyone close enough to see what it looked like. That was wrong. My daughters needed more support than I could give them alone. And now they have it? Now they have Mrs. Hartwell, and she's been..." He stopped. "She's been very good. For all of us." He didn't look at Clara when he said it. She was glad for that. If he'd looked at her, she wasn't sure she'd have managed her expression. Crew's cross-examination was precise and unpleasant in the way that good lawyers' cross-examinations were. Not cruel, just relentless, finding every edge and pressing against it. He questioned the timeline of improvements. He questioned the reliance on hired help as evidence of Nathan's own limitations. He returned twice to the winter 2 years ago, and Nathan answered him each time with the same flat steadiness, not defensive, not crumbling. When Crew sat down, Judge Holt looked at Nathan and said, "You may step down," and Nathan did. And Clara watched him walk back to the table and sit, and she thought, good, that was good. Garrett called Clara next. She walked to the stand with the same attention to steadiness she'd brought to the barn in February. Not performing calm, just actually applying it, which required the same mechanism. She sat down. She looked at the room. Vivian Sterling was looking at her from the petitioner's table with the still, assessing quality of a woman who was accustomed to judging people quickly and did not typically revise her judgments. Clara looked back at her, which seemed to mildly surprise her. Garrett began with the basics. Her employment, its terms, its duration, the daily structure of the household. What she prepared, maintained, organized. He was building the picture the way she'd built it in her letter to him in January. Systematically, specifically, one true detail at a time. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "in the 4 months you've been at Silver Ridge, how would you characterize Nathan Cross's conduct as a father?" She thought about how to say it accurately. "He's not the kind of man who says much," she said. "He shows things instead. He fixed a latch on the girl's wardrobe the same day Abigail mentioned it to him, without being asked and without saying he'd done it. He put a new journal on the kitchen table when he noticed Abigail had filled the last one. He went out in the dark one morning after I told him Rose had remembered something her mother taught her about the garden, and I think he went to look at it." She paused. "He's been trying. Every day since I arrived, he's been trying in the particular, imperfect, daily way that matters more than any kind of trying that only happens when someone's watching." "Ipus? Garrett nodded. "And the children? In your assessment, how are Abigail and Rose Cross?" "Abigail is one of the most capable 12-year-olds I've ever met," Clara said. "She's sharp, and she's difficult, and she's fiercely loyal, and she is exactly what you'd expect from a child who decided that getting hurt again wasn't worth the risk. She's beginning to change her mind about that. Rose didn't speak much when I arrived. She speaks now. She planted garlic in December because she remembered her mother teaching her how, and she got it right, depth and spacing and timing. All of it exactly right." She paused. "Those girls are not damaged beyond hope. They're damaged in the specific way that children are damaged by loss and uncertainty and not enough steadiness. What they need is steadiness, not Cheyenne." Crew rose for cross-examination. He was pleasant about it. He smiled with the professional smile, and he began as Garrett had predicted with the living arrangement. "Mrs. Hartwell, you reside at Silver Ridge Ranch." "I do." "In the house with Mr. Cross and his daughters." "Yes." "And you're paid a wage for your work there." $4 a month." $4. He repeated it in a tone that implied this was either very little or very much depending on how you looked at it. "And your personal feelings about the Cross family. Would you describe them as professional?" She looked at him directly. "My feelings about the Cross family are what you'd expect from someone who has lived and worked alongside people for 4 months. I care about them. That doesn't make what I've observed untrue." "You care about Mr. Cross specifically?" "I care about all of them, the girls and Nathan." "Nathan," Crew said, as if the first name were significant. "Mr. Cross," she corrected without inflection. "Is it possible," Crew said carefully, "that your testimony reflects not what you've objectively observed, but what you hope to be true, given your personal investment in the household's future?" Clara looked at him. She thought about Garrett's instruction. Tell the truth, whatever the truth is. "It's possible," she said. "I'd ask the court to consider whether that's more or less reliable than the testimony of a woman whose primary income depends on Vivian Sterling's goodwill." A sound in the room. Not loud, not laughter, something smaller and sharper. Judge Holt's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, minimally. Crew moved on. He asked about the winter 2 years ago, what she knew of it, how she'd learned of it, whether Nathan had disclosed it voluntarily. She answered each question honestly. He asked about the man in the barn. She had known he would, because Garrett had told Vivian's side she would testify about it, and had provided the account in pre-hearing documentation. Crew approached it as if he'd like to minimize it. "You confronted this individual alone," he said. "I did. Isn't it true that you can't confirm who sent him?" "He told me Vivian Sterling sends her regards," Clara said. "That was his exact language. He could have been trespassing for any number of reasons. He was in the tack room with a satchel containing a folded ledger page that did not belong there," Clara said. "Draw your own conclusions." Crew looked at his papers. He was recalibrating. She could see it, the slight adjustment, the decision about which threads were still worth pulling. He asked 2 more questions that were less effective than the ones before them, and then he sat down. "But," Abigail asked to speak. It was not a scheduled part of the hearing. Garrett had discussed the possibility with Nathan, and both of them had decided against asking the girls to testify, on the grounds that Crew would cross-examine them, and that was a thing neither of them wanted to expose Abigail or Rose to. But when Garrett rose to call his next witness, Abigail stood up from the row behind the respondent's table and said, "I'd like to say something." Garrett looked at Judge Holt. Holt looked at Abigail. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man revising his plans. "How old are you?" he asked. 12, Abigail said, "and I know what this hearing is about. I've known for 2 months. I'd like to say something if the court will allow it." Holt looked at Crew, who looked at Vivian, who made a very slight movement of the hand that Clara read as "let her talk." Vivian's mistake. "I'll hear you," Holt said. "Come forward." Abigail walked to the stand with her back straight and her braid neat, and the particular bearing of a girl who had decided she was not going to be small in this room. She sat down. She looked at the judge. "My grandmother believes she's rescuing us," Abigail said. "I'd like her to understand that we don't need rescuing, not by her." She said it without drama and without trembling, which made it more effective than either would have been. "My father has not been perfect," she continued. "He'd tell you that himself. He was very sad for a long time, and he didn't always know how to be with us when he was that sad. But sad is not the same as unfit." She paused. "He's been getting better. Not because someone told him to or because there's a hearing, because he decided to. I've watched him decide it every day." Crew rose. "Your Honor, if I may cross-examine, briefly," Holt said. Crew turned to Abigail with the professional smile. "Abigail, you love your father." "Yes." "And it's natural to want to protect him." "I'm not protecting him," Abigail said. "I'm telling you what I've seen. There's a difference." "Your grandmother loves you too. She wants what's best." "She wants us in Cheyenne," Abigail said, "in a house where the furniture's too good to sit on. She wants us to be the proof that she did everything right." She looked at Vivian directly across the room. "I know the difference between someone who wants what's best for you and someone who wants you. Grandmother wants us. Papa wants what's best for us, even when it's hard for him." She looked back at the judge. "That's what I wanted to say." Holt looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "You can step down." Rose did not ask to speak, but when Abigail came back and sat down, Rose took her hand, and Abigail, who had been entirely composed through the whole of it, took a breath that was not quite steady. Eleanor took the stand in the early afternoon. She had asked Garrett that morning to let her speak last among their witnesses, and Garrett had agreed. Clara understood why, watching her settle into the chair. She needed to be the one who closed the door, not the one who opened it. Garrett's examination was careful and brief. He established her identity, her relationship to the children, her current circumstances. He asked her about Vivian's role in her decision to leave Silver Ridge. Eleanor looked at her hands once, then at the judge. "My mother told me Nathan was building a case to have me declared an unfit mother," she said. "She told me she had documentation. She told me that if I didn't leave on my own terms, I would be removed and never have access to the girls again." "Paanam?" She paused. I believed her. I shouldn't have. Nathan had never threatened anything of the sort. It was not in his character, and if I had thought clearly instead of in panic, I would have known that. But my mother is very persuasive, and I was already frightened, and I left. "And the documentation," Garrett said. "Didn't exist," Eleanor said. "There was never any documentation. I've confirmed this. My mother manufactured the threat." Garrett asked about Vivian's motives. Eleanor answered without hesitation. My mother has always believed that she knows best for everyone in her family, she said. She believed I'd married badly. She believed Nathan was below our station, and she resented the girls being raised as ranch children, as she called them, rather than as Sterling children. She wanted them back under her influence. The simplest way to accomplish that was to remove me from the house and then use my absence against Nathan. And the girls themselves, Garrett said, having spent time with them this weekend, in your assessment, are Abigail and Rose being well cared for? Eleanor looked at Clara without meaning to. It was a quick look, involuntary, and she moved her eyes back to the judge. Yes, she said. They're more themselves than I'd feared. Abigail talks. Rose laughs sometimes. Her voice did something at that. She held it. Someone has been very good to them while I couldn't be. Crew's cross-examination was his most aggressive of the day, and it was the most interesting to watch because he was trying to undermine the testimony of a woman who had nothing to protect and nothing to gain by lying. He questioned her account of Vivian's manipulation, her timeline, her absence. Eleanor answered each question with a steadiness that looked expensive. It was clearly costing her something to stay that still. But she didn't break and she didn't embellish and she didn't give him a single edge to push against. When he finally sat down, the afternoon light through the tall, narrow windows had gone from white to gold. Vivian Sterling rose without being asked. Holt looked at her. Mrs. Sterling, you are the petitioner. You'll have opportunity for closing statement in the appropriate— I need to speak, Vivian said. Not sharply. She had the manner of a woman who believed firmly in decorum and would exercise it even in extremity. Not testimony. I need to address the court. Holt considered. You may speak briefly. What followed was not what Clara expected. She had expected Vivian to attack Eleanor's account, Nathan's character, the circumstances of Clara's presence in the house. What she got was something stranger and in some ways more troubling. A woman who believed, with complete and organized sincerity, that she was right. Vivian spoke about Eleanor's childhood, about the care and expense and attention she'd given both daughters, Eleanor and her sister, who had died young. She spoke about her fear when Eleanor married Nathan, which she described not as snobbery, but as genuine concern. She spoke about the girls, her granddaughters, with a specificity and warmth that was unmistakably real. She knew the things they liked, the books they'd read, the small details that a person only knows if they have actually paid attention. It was not a monstrous speech. That was the difficult thing. It was the speech of a woman who had done a monstrous thing out of convictions she'd held so long she'd stopped being able to see around them. I have only ever wanted what is best for those children, Vivian said. She looked at Nathan. I made errors in how I pursued this. But my intentions— The road to harm, Garrett said quietly, not quite to anyone, not quite to himself, in the pause after Vivian stopped, is built on intention. Holt gave him a look. Garrett adjusted his papers. Holt looked at Vivian. Thank you, Mrs. Sterling, he said. Please be seated. The closing statements took 40 minutes. Then Judge Holt said he would recess to consider his ruling. The recess lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Clara took the girls to a bench in the hall and sat with them. Nathan stood at the far end of the hall near the window. And after a while, Eleanor went and stood near him. Not with him, just near. And they spoke in voices too low to carry. Garrett sat on the opposite bench reading through his papers again, because Garrett, Clara suspected, was a man who needed something to do with his hands while he waited, and papers were the thing he had. Rose fell asleep against Clara's arm, the stone still in her fist, her breathing going slow and even, with the uncanny ability children had to sleep through the things adults couldn't. Abigail sat straight and didn't sleep. After a while she said, Do you think it worked? What I said? Yes, Clara said. You don't know that. I know it was true, and I know the judge heard it, and I know it was better than anything else that could have been said. Whether it worked is Holt's decision now. Abigail was quiet then. I almost cried up there. I know. I didn't. I know. Clara looked at her. You were remarkable. Abigail looked at the far end of the hall, at her parents standing together in the window light, not touching, not quite at ease with each other, but present and still. Is everything going to be different now? She asked. Yes, Clara said. In some ways, not all of them will be easy. That's not a very comforting answer. I'm not going to lie to you about it. Abigail looked at her with the dark eyes that were her mother's and her father's both. I know, she said. That's why I asked you instead of someone else. The courthouse door opened. A clerk appeared in the hallway. Judge Holt is ready, he said. Rose woke without being startled, as if some part of her had stayed alert the whole time. She sat up and looked at Clara, and then at the clerk, and then at her father crossing the hall toward them. She took her hand out of her pocket with the stone in it and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket. Okay, she said, to no one in particular, or to all of them. They went back into the courtroom. Holt read his ruling without preamble, which was the manner of a man who had considered the matter and was not interested in extending the theatrical portion of the day. The petition for guardianship was denied. He read it, and then he read the reasoning, which was carefully constructed and did not sensationalize. He found no preponderance of evidence to support the claim that Nathan Cross was unfit. He found the testimony of the character witnesses for the respondent to be credible and specific. He noted, and Clara felt this land in the room in a particular way, that the court was concerned about the methods employed by the petitioner's counsel in the preparation of evidence, and that this concern would be referred to the appropriate office for review. He looked at Vivian Sterling when he said that last part. She sat very still. He ruled the children to remain in their father's custody. He further noted that the biological mother's right to contact was a separate matter not adjudicated here, and that he would encourage the parties to address it through appropriate channels. Then he gathered his papers and left. The room exhaled. Clara heard it. Not any one person's breath, but the room's, the combined release of held things, the specific quality of air in a space where something difficult had resolved. Nathan was at the table with his head down and both hands flat on the wood, not performing anything, just there, holding himself against the surface of the moment. Garrett was writing something. Eleanor had pressed one hand over her mouth. Vivian Sterling rose and left through the side door without speaking to anyone, crew behind her, and Greta Morse, who had the look of a woman who had done what she was asked to do and was now not sure how she felt about it, following at a careful distance. Rose came around the respondent's table and put her arms around Nathan from the side, her head against his arm, and Nathan brought his hand up and held the back of her head, and his eyes were closed, and he was not entirely composed, and Clara thought, good, that's the right way to be right now. Abigail stood at the end of the table and looked at the room. She had the expression of someone who had been tensed against an impact and was slowly, incrementally, allowing herself to believe it wasn't coming. She looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. Good, Abigail said. It was a small word for everything it was carrying, but it was the right one. Eleanor came around from the other side and crouched next to Rose, who released Nathan and turned to her mother with the uncomplicated movement of an 8-year-old who has decided that things are going to be held one piece at a time, and this piece, right now, is this. Eleanor held her and looked at Nathan over the top of Rose's head, and Nathan looked back, and neither of them said anything. Garrett came and shook Nathan's hand. We'll need to address the contact arrangements with Eleanor in the next few weeks, he said, while the goodwill is present. I know, Nathan said. We'll deal with it. You'll need to talk to the girls about what that looks like. I know that too. Garrett looked at Clara. Mrs. Hartwell, your testimony today was... He paused, evidently selecting the word. Essential, he said. It was true, Clara said. That's all it was. He smiled, small and genuine. In my experience, the two are rarer together than they should be. He went to gather his papers, and Clara stood in the emptying courtroom in the late afternoon light and looked at the room that had held the whole of this day. The testimony and the waiting, and Abigail not crying on the stand, and Rose's stone, and Eleanor's steady voice, and Nathan's hands flat on the desk, and the ruling that had come down simply and completely. And she thought, done. Not fixed. Not finished in the larger sense. But done. This piece of it. And that was enough for today. Nathan appeared beside her. The girls were with Eleanor near the door, and he'd stepped back, giving them that. And he stood beside Clara in the nearly empty room with the light going amber in the windows. You said we'd talk, he said. After. I did. It's after. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd first seen at the paddock fence in October, the one that didn't fit any category she'd put him in. And it was more direct now than it had been then, less guarded. A man who had just watched the worst thing he could imagine fail to happen was not, it turned out, the same man as before. He was still sealed in places. He was still going to be difficult in the particular, exhausting, honest way he was difficult. But the glass was gone from the window. "Not here," she said, "and not today." "No," he agreed, "but soon." "Soon," she said. Outside, through the tall courthouse windows, the February sky was doing something extraordinary. The light had gone entirely gold, the kind of late winter light that only lasted minutes before the cold dark took it, and it was coming through the glass and lying in long rectangles across the courtroom floor, and it was the most ordinary, beautiful thing she had seen in months. She looked at it and let it be what it was. They drove back to Silver Ridge in the dark. Nathan had the reins, and the girls were in the wagon bed behind him, Rose asleep within the first mile, Abigail awake and watching the stars come out over the Wyoming plain. Clara sat on the bench beside Nathan. The cold was serious but windless, and the horses moved at an easy pace that made the whole of it feel, for the first time in months, unhurried. Nobody said much. There wasn't much that needed saying yet. Halfway home, Nathan reached across and put his hand briefly over Clara's where it rested on the bench. Not a declaration, just contact, acknowledgement, the specific language of a man who had said soon and meant it. She turned her hand and let his rest against her palm for a moment, and then the horses needed tending, and the moment passed, and the stars were extraordinary in the February dark above the open country. Silver Ridge was cold when they arrived. She got the kitchen fire going while Nathan unhitched the horses, and by the time he came back in the kitchen was warm, and the girls had gone upstairs without being asked. Nathan sat at the table. He looked tired in a way that was different from usual. Not depleted, just emptied of the specific tension he'd been carrying since January. Clara put 2 cups on the table and sat across from him. "Eleanor asked to come in the spring," he said, "to see the girls. What do you think?" He turned the cup. "I think Abigail needs time to decide how she feels, and Rose needs someone to explain why it's complicated, why we can be glad her mother is coming and still be angry about how long it took." "I can help with that conversation," Clara said, "if you want." "I know you can." He looked at her. "You testified today that you care about this family." "I did. Crew tried to use it against you." "He tried." Nathan leaned back slightly. "I know I'm not easy to be around," he said. "I know what I am. I'm not going to make a speech, but I want you to know that what you did today, who you've been in this house." He ran out of words in the way that was clearly unusual for him, and he was visibly dissatisfied with it. "Nathan," Clara said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the foundation of one. "Soon," he said. "Soon," she agreed. They drank their tea, and the fire settled in the range, and the house was quiet above them. He asked properly in June. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with a small box that had clearly been sitting in his desk for weeks, and set it on the table beside her coffee cup. "I'd like you to have this," he said. "It was my grandmother's, and I'd like you to be my wife, if you'll have me." It was not a smooth declaration. It was a careful, imperfect, honest man asking a careful, imperfect, honest woman to bind their lives together with full knowledge of what both those lives had contained. She opened the box, a simple gold band, narrow, worn to a soft shine. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "That's all?" "You said you wanted straightforward." "I did," he said. "Yes, I did say that." She put the ring on and they stood in the kitchen, and it was quiet upstairs where the girls were still sleeping, and the bread she'd started at 5 was rising under a cloth on the counter, and nothing about the moment was cinematic. It was just real, which was everything. Abigail found out at breakfast. She looked at Clara's left hand, then at her father, then back at Clara's hand. "Are you going to be our mother?" she asked Clara directly. "No," Clara said. "You have a mother. She's coming in April, and that's going to be its own complicated thing we'll figure out together. I'm going to be the woman who married your father. What that means between you and me, we'll decide over time." I'm not putting a name on it and telling you how to feel." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "You've been here since October," she said. "I have. You braided my hair 200 times. You went after that man in the barn with a fire iron. That too." She picked up her fork. "Fine," she said. One word, carrying everything. Rose put her gray stone on the table next to Clara's plate. "You can hold it today if you want," she said. "It helps." Clara picked it up. It was warm from Rose's pocket, smooth from years of being held through hard things. "Thank you, Rose," she said. Rose nodded and ate her breakfast. They were married that same June, on a Saturday, with the Wyoming mountains behind the ranch and the sky its specific deep blue. Abigail stood with Clara. Rose stood with Nathan. It was not a large event or a perfect one. Nathan said his part like a man who had practiced and was worried about getting it wrong. And Clara got a grass stain on her hem fixing Rose's hair at the last minute, and Abigail cried despite telling everyone she would not, which she addressed by turning away and blowing her nose with considerable force. Nobody acknowledged it. When it was done, Nathan looked at Clara with the unguarded look that was his real face, the one that existed when none of the hatches were battened. And she looked back, and it needed nothing added to it. Eleanor came in April as promised. She stayed 4 days. The conversations she and Nathan had were difficult and necessary, and Clara was not present for any of them. She was where she was most useful, in the house with the girls, keeping the ordinary thread intact so the hard things could happen alongside it without pulling everything apart. Rose spent the first afternoon in the garden, showing her mother the garlic rows, pointing out each one with the precision she'd inherited from Eleanor's own teaching. Clara watched from the kitchen window and let it be outside her field of vision, because some things were not hers to witness directly, and that was all right. Abigail waited 2 days, then sat with her mother at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Clara heard later she'd done most of the talking, that Eleanor had listened without explaining herself too much, that when Abigail came out she said she needed more time, and that April was a bad month for anyone serious about the garden, which was exactly Abigail. 2 years later, in October, Clara had a son. She told Nathan in March with the same directness she brought to most things, and he sat very still and then stood and held her, which was the most purely uncalculated thing she'd ever seen him do. She told the girls together at breakfast. Rose said, "I knew it," with complete serene confidence. Abigail said nothing for a long moment, and then, "Is it going to change things?" "Yes," Clara said. "Which things?" "I don't know yet. We'll figure it out as it comes." Abigail considered this. "Okay," she said. "That's honest, at least." The boy came in October. Nathan held him in the kitchen on the first morning home with the careful, effortful attention he brought to every hard thing, and looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't have put into words. They named him Thomas. She had asked for it, and Nathan had said yes without hesitation, the way he said yes to things that actually mattered. And she thought, this is how it goes. You carry the dead with you, and you name things after them, and they become part of the living landscape, not replacing anything, just present. Rose held the baby with extraordinary seriousness, the stone in her pocket since her hands were occupied. She looked at his face a long time. "He looks worried," she said. "New babies often do." "I think he's going to be fine," Rose said, with the authority of someone who had seen many worried things be fine eventually. On an evening in the 5th autumn, Clara stood at the paddock fence alone. The children were in the house. Nathan was in the barn with a restless mare. Rose was in the garden with a lantern. Thomas was finally asleep. She looked at the mountains in the October dark and thought about the woman who had walked up this drive 5 years ago. Cracked lips, mud-stiff hem, 17 closed doors behind her, and a specific quiet desperation she had not let show on her face because showing it would have given it too much room. She would have liked to tell that woman something, not "it gets better," which is useless to say to someone in the middle of it, something more specific, something like, "Keep walking," not because you know it will be all right, you don't and you won't for a while, but because belonging somewhere is not a place you find. It's a thing you build, and you cannot build it if you stop before you find the ground. Something like, the 18th door is not going to look like a door. It's going to look like cornbread on a porch rail, and a man who asks if you've eaten, and a child who says she likes biscuits and means something larger than biscuits by it. Something like, You're going to lose people you cannot afford to lose, and you're going to keep walking anyway. And it is going to cost you, and it is still going to be worth it. Not because the losses weren't real, they were, they are, they always will be, but because the living you do after them is real too, and you owe it to yourself and to them to let it be. Inside the house, Thomas woke and started crying, the short, indignant cry of a 2-year-old who had found himself in the dark without his mother. Clara turned from the fence and walked back across the yard, through the back door and into the warm kitchen, up the stairs and into the room where her son was waiting. She picked him up and he quieted immediately, the way children do when the specific person they were crying for arrives. "I'm here," she said. "I've got you." He made the small settling sound. His fist closed against her collar. She stood at the window and looked out over Silver Ridge, the dark yard, the barn light, the thin lantern glow from the garden, the mountains that were always there, indifferent and magnificent. This was not the life she had planned. It was the life she had built, imperfectly, honestly, with her own hands and the hands of people who had let her in when they didn't have to. And it was hers, completely, irrevocably hers. She held her son in the October dark, and the house breathed around her. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that keeping the door open had made possible, in the end.